part of Central Texas Mycology's mission is to destigmatize and also end mycophobia. And we think that all mushrooms are magical. So, I just came from a mushroom gardening workshop, clearly with the garden boots on. So we're trying to cover the whole spectrum of helping people get myceliated. And so definitely check us out. We're also a member-based organization. And we've got a lot of great things going on coming up. So I'm one of the lead organizers with Central Texas Mycology. These are some of my Melfies. I worked in tech for a long time, and once I started to learn about like this sort of invisible underground network, I'm like, what am I doing at a desk job? I've got to get out of here and go do some gardening and get in the forest and change some things up in my life. And I'm able to really engage people and be an educator in the community around all things mycology. So my sort of origin stories, I grew up in foster care. And at a very young age, I tried psilocybin. I was thinking it was like a recreational thing. I was just trying to I was depressed and poor me, going through all kinds of stuff that, teenagers go through. And it really helped me come out of that, feelings of isolation and loneliness. And it really transformed my life and gave me the sort of messages I needed to sort of overcome a lot of things in my adult life. And I even refer back to that period even today as I'm continuing to grow as an adult. Part of my learnings are, seeing how people all over the world have used these medicines like I did when I was younger. So in the first part of our presentation, which is online, and I apologize, the audio is kind of messed up for the first few minutes. So, but on our Central Texas Mycology YouTube channel, you can watch the first part. But we took a mushroom trip all around the world, exploring early art as it relates to fungi. We learned about early polytheistic tribes and civilizations all over the world, including early Christians who used mushrooms and plants in their religious practices. The sacred mushrooms used in these rituals to commune and find harmony with the planet were reflected in their artifacts, their religious texts. Recommend checking out the first part. It's not necessarily, you're going to be able to follow along with everything happening today. But today I'm going to focus on the so-called war on drugs, right? Which to me, when I started to really dig into things, it's a war on nature. And so we will learn how the war on nature is a tool by the ruling class to maintain power. We will observe art and artifacts as polytheistic religions were replaced with monotheistic ones. I'm going to start explaining how alchemy was introduced to Europe and how monotheistic religions took shape leading to the Crusades and then into Western colonization. And so we will continue into the 60s and 70s in the US, where the war on drugs was codified, then into the 21st century, and look at how mushrooms are used in contemporary art, movies, video games, and more. We're going to see how the spiritual was replaced with the material, and the collective consciousness was replaced with individualism, and art as a commodity grew out of that paradigm. And so we'll also see how sacred mushrooms are portrayed subversively as a rebellion against the ruling class. So in order to understand how the so-called war on drugs started, we have to learn about how drugs or medicine came to be what they are today. And so some of you all probably know this, but the precursor to chemistry and medicine was called alchemy. And alchemy existed in ancient Greece, North Africa, and Asia, and the Middle East long before it arrived to Europe during the medieval period. And each country had different names and techniques, but what they had in common was their direct relationship with nature through art and healing. And in Egypt, Alchemy was a great art gifted by Thoth, the god of language, math, and science. The Greeks further declared him the inventor of astronomy, astrology, the science of numbers, mathematics, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, theology, civilized government, the alphabet, reading, writing, oratory. They further claimed he was the true author of every work of every branch of knowledge. So yeah, thought, let's give it up. Woo. And these are some of my favorite pieces of work throughout time. And the one in the middle, you can see at the Brooklyn Museum. And so when the Roman Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he gained access to all of the Egyptian artifacts and secrets. This included the famous emerald tablets and the 42 Hermetic scrolls created some 38,000 years ago in the ancient Phoenician language. They were found in a tomb in Heliopolis. And so he placed the scrolls in the sacred archives and put the emerald tablets on display. And construction of the city of Alexandria and the famous library to house and study the Hermetic texts began immediately. And he assembled a panel of priests and scholars to prepare translations. So he was kind of like the open source bro of his time, in my opinion. And so the ancient emerald tablets and Hermetic scrolls were said to include the secrets of the universe and include alchemy, astrology, philosophy, geography, medicine, theology, and music texts. The tablets were known to contain the philosopher's stone, also called the elixir of life, useful for rejuvenation or achieving immortality. And Hermetic philosophy teaches that all things come from one thing, the prima materia, which is a web of being and spirit. As time went on, the philosopher's stone was interpreted as a formula that could transmute any base metal into gold. And this eventually was the most sought after gold in alchemy when it reached Europe. And so these are some art pieces of Hermes, who is considered to be a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And he is the purported author of the Hermetica, all of these texts. And this replica of the original image of Hermes is probably from the 16th or 17th century, and it seems to relate to alchemy, which is the sun, the moon, fire, which are alchemical symbols. And you also see a floor mosaic that's in the Cathedral of Siena, I think in Venice, and a replica of an engraving on the right. That one's in Venice. And so Arabic translations were eventually translated to Latin in the Middle Ages, and a translation by Sir Isaac Newton is found among his alchemical papers that are currently housed at Cambridge. And these translations and knowledge were being brought from Northern Africa and the Arab world is what brought Europe out of the Dark Ages into the so-called Age of Discovery. The monarchies and Roman Catholic Church really controlled who had access to star maps, sea routes, and this is really how Western colonization began. So this sort of discovery wasn't so much of a discovery, but translations of these, all of these texts that came from Northern Africa. And so the Anglo-Saxons began to prosper off the resources and labor of people all over the world. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist that spent a lot of time trying to understand the subconscious, identified the emerald tablet with a table made of green stone, which he encountered in his first set of dreams and visions. He described them in his writings, The Seven Sermons of the Dead, to the Dead. He also famously said, "For the alchemist, the one primarily in need of redemption is not man, but the deity who is lost and sleeping in matter." And so he was trying to say God is in everything. And so Jung interpreted the emerald tablets as something that was achieved through a higher consciousness, not something material as a formula for turning base metals into gold. He believed these writings pronounced a universal knowledge and the story of our connection to the one being, which is expressed in all beings, something that did not gel with the monotheistic religions that were dominant in the West. So ethnobotanist and consciousness guru Terence McKenna agrees, calling the tablets a formula for a holographic matrix that is mirrored in the human mind and offers mankind the only hope for future survival. And the ancients clearly possessed a genuine science of consciousness, which is really an understanding of dark matter. The ancients compared this to the veil of ignorance, which must be pierced to allow light and of consciousness to shine through. And in the Vedic or Indian alchemy, it was called Veda. This could not be achieved through materialism. And to this day, it's a great mystery to where the emerald tablets and all of these Hermetic texts are hidden and the contents of the Philosopher's Stone. And like Jung and Terence McKenna, some believe that it is immaterial. The tablets were supposedly buried during the time the scholars were imprisoned, and libraries, including the Alexandria Library, were burned down by religious zealots during the Roman conquest. So in the medieval period in Europe, fungi was still classified in both the plant and animal kingdoms, and it was very mysterious. Alchemists in the Middle Ages sought to find the secrets of creation of life from elixirs of mushrooms, minerals, plants, and even animals in experimentations. There were many books on alchemy published at the time, including this one by a German named Faust, which compares the power of chemical science to a double-edged sword, powerful and dangerous in the wrong hands. Faust is famous in history for selling his soul to the dark side. This is known as the Faustian bargain, which is a pact when a person trades something of supreme moral or spiritual importance, such as personal values or the soul, for something worldly or material, such as knowledge, power, and riches. And choosing between a binary of good versus evil will be a common theme as we study art and the war on drugs. And this binary thinking took shape during this time as early Christian religions were gaining dominance. And so European alchemy was a mixture of science, philosophy, and mysticism. The art was filled with a lot of esoteric symbolism. The prominence that it gave to the idea of influencing or controlling nature led many scientists to look to magic and its allied arts, such as astrology, which was thought could put nature to the test by means of experiments. There was no formal scientific method, so there were a lot of many diverging texts, and some alchemists and their apprentices were accidentally died in all of these experiments with elixirs. And as the Crusades in Europe continued, the obsession with the quest for gold and good and evil and expulsion of demons were found all over art. There are only a few examples that include fungi or mushrooms because it was largely ignored. These are some anonymous engravings from the 1600s. This one called Expulsion of Demons is a classic example of alchemical initiation of having demons baked out of one's head into a billowing cloud containing the universal elements and an expanding consciousness. And seen here are two mushrooms joined at the cap and appeared in the lower left of the expanding mind cloud. It's kind of blurry, but in this illustration from the Book of Lambspring, we see a man intoxicated on Amanita muscaria mushroom. He clutches one mushroom in his hand as he dances about, holding his other hand and his forehead as if the revelations are too intense. And behind him, a tree grows with a spotted mushroom for a top. And to the right, we see the 12th century fresco on the church in France of Adam and Eve at the mushroom tree of life. And this is a very similar motif of the tree of life that we saw a lot in the first part of the talk. And so here's a few other examples. So now alchemy is mostly accepted as a precursor to modern chemistry, and many of the processes from that time are still used today. And the center symbol you see here is the catechus, I think I'm saying it right, or the staff of Hermes, which is the modern symbol for medicine. You can see how it is derived from religious symbols from early art. And since there wasn't a formal scientific process or peer review that we all know of today, the practice led to many divisions. And so alchemy became associated with the so-called occult and was considered heresy and banned by the Catholic Church. And so you see here, Galileo was even convicted of heresy for resurrecting the old Greek Copernicus theory that the earth revolves around the sun. And since Christianity and Judaism are paternal religions, they came into power after overcoming maternal religions. And the Catholic Church thought of Galileo's heliocentrism as a revival of a maternal religion, because it implies that Mother Earth moves by itself and makes the sun, the symbol of the Father God, would fall. And the English crown, also fearing the potential devaluation of gold should the philosopher's stone actually be discovered, made penalties for alchemy very severe. And as you can see, this was clearly about consolidation of power, and alchemy was forced underground. We all know about Joan of Arc being burned at the stake and the witch trials that were held all over Europe and the US. And some scholars believe that some of these so-called witches were hallucinating from ergot, a fungus that grows on wet rye. And ergot contains lysogenic acid, which is the precursor for the synthesis of LSD. And so nearly all of the accusers lived in a western region of Salem Village, a region that has swampy meadows that would be a prime breeding ground for this fungus. And it was probably consumed in some sort of beer. And so psychotropic mushrooms and herbs were used in beer, or what we also call gruit ales, until about 1516, when the German government and the Catholic Church implemented the Bavarian purity laws, or Reinheitsgebot. This required that barley, hops, which is a sedative, and water only be used in beer. And this stamp, issued in 1983, commemorated the 450th anniversary. They were strictly enforced in many parts of Europe. Before the purity law, one ingredient used in beer was psychedelic mushrooms, the fly agaric, which was widely used in pagan rituals throughout Europe, as we learned in the first talk. And it offers a natural, easily accessible way to a transcendental, mystical awakening. And not only that, but magic mushrooms literally expand the human mind and can increase a person's cognitive power, neither of which helped the Catholic Church maintain its control over Europe. In 1986, the purity laws were finally overturned. And over the past several years, there's been an explosion of beers with all types of edible mushrooms and other herbs and ingredients. I know of several places in town that do gruit ales or wild crafted ales and add mushrooms to their beer. So I did this talk originally like 2 years ago, and when I did a search on Untapped, there was only 363 beers on the wall. Well, I did another search last night, and now there's 541 mushroom beers on the wall, which is really, really awesome. Is that on the wall, or what is that song? Oh, okay. Like, what am I? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica in 1519, they believed that mushrooms used in sacred rituals allowed the Aztecs to communicate with the devils. This made it easy to justify the death of many of the indigenous people that were killed by tortured or got diseases during the Inquisition. So here is the 17th century painting of the fall of the Aztec Empire. And before photographs, Facebook ID groups, and DNA sequencing, botanical illustrations, songs, poetry, and folk wisdom is how people learn to correctly identify mushrooms. And if you were royalty, you had your own botanical illustrator. And so Claude Aubry was a French illustrator and botanical artist to King Louis the Great. And his mushroom paintings date back here to 1730. And Aubry created nearly 800 paintings in return for very little recognition of his art and artistry. And a select portion of his illustrations can now be it was published in 2010 by the University of Chicago Press, but here's a few beautiful, some Hericium fistulana, that's like the beefsteak mushroom. These guys, the parasol mushrooms, they're popping up everywhere right now. Maybe a different species here. This was in Europe. But here's two illustrations from an 1800s field guide that incorrectly identified the death cap, the Amanita phalloides, as Amanita maca, which contains almost no toxins. And so to the right is a poem that was written by Meg Beagle. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, several historical figures died from eating death caps by accident or assassination. So here's a lineup of people that died from mushrooms. So Roman Emperor Claudius, Pope Clement VII, Tsarita of Russia, Natalia Narishkina, and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. And shortly after Charles VI's death from a meal of mushrooms, the War of the Austrian Succession broke out, and many of the borders changed in this part of the world. And the famous French philosopher Voltaire was quoted saying, "A dish of mushrooms changed the destiny of Europe." And these famous deaths in Europe led to an intense culture of mycophobia. The fear of accidental poisoning appeared to have cast doubts over the nutritional and medicinal value of mushrooms. The language used around mushrooms was often viscerally hostile, drawing upon the images of filth and waste. Several writers referred to them as excrements of the earth, or a bundle of putrefaction arising of a cold, moist, vicious matter of the earth. The Victorian world still expressed deep ambivalence about fungi, even though children's books, fairy stories, and are popular with innocent versions of the fly agarics and toadstools and pixies dancing in fairy rings, as you see here in this painting. The particular genre dealt with the underworld of fairies and elves, and European superstitions routinely warned against entering a fairy ring. If you dare to enter the ring, many myths warned you will die young. You also became invisible to the mortal world, unable to escape the ring, or you are transported instantly into the fairy realm. And every culture had slightly different superstitions. And there's actually a really good wiki article that has like all of the varying theories from these different cultures in Europe. And so this spooky fairy ring painting by George, and I can't say his last name, he is the illustrator for the first Grimm fairy tale. So this romantic genre associated with romantic literature at the time provided a sense of escapism. And so many artists painted scenes from the popular Shakespeare's A Midnight Summer Dream, as you see here. And Disney even got into the fairy game in 1940 with Fantasia film. And at the time, it was considered a masterpiece in animation and composition. It featured dancing hippos, fairies, and mushrooms in the segment set to Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. The animators found inspiration in the movements of the mushrooms from the Three Stooges. And we're not going to watch it, but yeah, just take note, and I can send out a link to everybody to all the movies that I include in here. And so modern science can explain fairy rings. So the mycelium of fungus growing in the ground absorbs nutrients by secretion of enzymes from the tips of the hyphae. And this breaks down larger molecules in the soil into smaller molecules that are then absorbed through the walls of the hyphae near their growing tips. The mycelium will move outward from the center, and when the nutrients in the center are exhausted, the center dies, or it becomes non-nutritious, and then it forms the fairy ring. The mushrooms come up to try to spread more spores and keep moving further out. So here I am over by the White Horse and Yellow Jacket Social Club, and this was Chlorophyllum mollibites, which is a toxic mushroom growing in some landscaping mulch. But yeah, I was wearing my 4th of July mushroom dress. It was on 4th of July.
How many mushroom outfits do you have?
It's funny. Most of them, like, people give to me, so I don't even have to. I maybe have bought like four or five shirts, maybe. So around this same period of art, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was written. It includes the famous illustration of a mushroom larger than humans. Much debate over the type of magical mushroom has gone on through the centuries, and it is now known that John Tenniel, the book's illustrator, did not have a scientific background, but his inspiration from the drawing was from drawing in the magazine Punch. And it was a parody of the Pope at the time, which they would draw as a caterpillar. And to the right is a photo from Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland movie, where you see the mushrooms are Amanita muscaria. And so it is, however, documented that a few days before writing Alice in Wonderland, Carroll made his only ever visit to the Bodleian Library, where a copy of Mordecai Cook's recently published drug survey, The Seven Sisters of Sleep, which was published in 1960, had been deposited. The copy of this book is missing the chapter on the fly agaric, or the Amanita muscaria. So Carroll was particularly interested in all things Russian. In fact, Russia was the only country he had ever visited outside of Britain. And we learned that in the last talk how the indigenous cultures in that region of the world near Siberia and Scandinavia consume the Amanita muscaria. Oh, sorry, everybody. We back on? Okay. All right. And so criminalization of use of substances from Mordecai Cook's book continued through the Victorian period. And mycophobia, misunderstanding of mushrooms, really didn't change until the French introduced mushrooms in haute couture, or haute cuisine. And this was imported into the US during the early colonial period. And so mushrooms were only used as a condiment and were used to make ketchup. So it was even purported that to be a favorite of author Jane Austen. And so Geo Watkins is a popular mushroom ketchup that you can still buy today. On Instagram, it's called the Victorian Umami, and it's a favorite in the UK, and it's also featured in the Downton Abbey cookbook, and it can still be bought online today. So yeah, I bought some and tried it. It kind of reminded me of Worcestershire. Didn't really, but it did have a nice texture. And tomatoes weren't used in ketchup until the 1830s, when, of course, it was sold as a popular medicine, bringing it back around to this sort of war on drugs theme. In 1934, Dr. John Cook Bennett claimed his recipe could cure diarrhea, indigestion, scurvy, jaundice, rheumatism. And due to these false claims, the ketchup medicine empire collapsed. Shortly thereafter, the Heinz family filled the spot with less bogus claims. And as America's interest in mushrooms grew, entire cookbooks were devoted to them. One of the first English language mushroom cookbooks is Kate Sargent's 100 Mushroom Receipts. And that's what people used to call recipes. And so it's published in 1899. And Sargent's work includes some fabulous Harry Potter sounding recipe titles, including the Copernus comatus soup, Leopetita procuria stew, or baked tricholoma per sodium. So yeah, I have a copy of the PDF if anybody wants some old mushroom recipes. And so in the book's introduction, Sargent describes the changing American attitudes towards mushrooms at the turn of the century. The general opinion in this country regarding mushrooms has been that, with one or two exceptions, all forms of fungus growth are either poisonous or unwholesome. But it is very gratifying to observe the change that is rapidly taking place in the public mind. And so the science of mycology was developing, and devoted amateurs were out in the fields and woods collecting. But popular antipathy and misunderstanding, the fungi still mostly dominated the sentiment. And so fungi was still either classified in the animal or plant kingdom. So amateur mycologists at the time also did not own scientific illustrations like these from 1890 from French scientific illustrator Adolphe Milot. And you can still buy this poster actually online, these posters. So children's book author and publisher Beatrix Potter of Peter Rabbit fame was also a close observer of the many details of nature, focused perhaps less notably on the secret world of fungi and lichens. At a time when women had no right to vote and virtually no access to higher education, very rarely owned property, and were themselves considered property of their husbands, Potter became a commercially successful writer and artist and used her royalties from her book to purchase the famed Hilltop Farm. So here you see Ernst Haeckel's work. He was a famous German biologist who described and named thousands of new species, mapped a genealogical tree relating all life forms, and coined many terms in biology. This was around the time when microscopes were invented, and his interpretations were very surreal, allowing for even more abstract detail that had never been seen before. So yeah, really beautiful. And this brings me to the next period of art, Surrealism. So during this period, art started to react to the ruling class that brought on World War I. So in a revolt against a society ruled by rational thought, the Surrealists tapped into the superior reality of the subconscious, painting unnerving, illogical scenes, many times mixing the real and the unreal. And here are a few artists that from that period who painted some abstract things that have very fungal shapes, in my opinion. Maybe some cordyceps, club fungus. Toyin, born Marie Sermanova, was a key member of the Czechoslovakian Surrealist movement. She was born female, and he referred to himself in the masculine gender, which is why he is named Toyin, which can be parsed in Czech as she's he. To the left, Toyin depicts a cluster of fungi, oysters perhaps, emerging from cracks in a wall near a sketched outline of a fox whose foot is strangling a blue bird on the wall's base. And in the second painting to the right, you'll see a very realistic painting of morels with surreal floating hands and a tissue. And this is kind of a really good depiction of how I felt this year when we had the drought and there were no morels. Like, this one really resonates with me. The Surrealist movement was male dominated, and it was often regarded as sexist, and it began to attract many women and became much more gender balanced as time went by, although many Surrealists were forced underground during the Nazi occupation in the Second World War. And many artists worked as illustrators, and here is an example of from the Soviet children's magazine Merzilka from 1924. The illustration shows shows anthropomorphized Amanita muscaria mushrooms with the text that translates to, we are coming, we'll exterminate the entire bourgeoisie. And so you can actually buy this illustration and I think on a t-shirt on, oh yeah, here we go, on sovietvisuals.com. So mushrooms were disturbingly used in a metaphor in anti-Semitic propaganda. So Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, is a children's book published by Julius Streicher in 1938. The title alludes to how just as difficult it is to tell a poisonous mushroom from one that is edible, it's difficult to tell a Jew apart from a Gentile. In this anti-Semitic book, wants to warn German children about the dangers posed by the Jewish community. Pretty awful. And so during World War II, many African Americans were segregated, fighting on the front lines. And the US states were still enforcing apartheid, otherwise known as separate but equal, at home and in the military. And it was widely known that Nazis learned how to divide and conquer through studying US slavery and Jim Crow laws, which existed in the US during World War II. And so I really like this photo of these soldiers and also the Langston Hughes quote. And after Japan had already surrendered, the US committed the ultimate act of war on nature by dropping the atomic bomb, which created a mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the US military wanted to set a precedent in fighting its next ideological enemy. And so here's some illustrations by atomic bomb survivors that are a chilling reminder of this crime against humanity. So matsutake is a highly prized edible mushroom that can fetch an extravagant prices in Japan, sometimes as high as $1,000 per kilogram, and known for its spicy aroma and taste, and some compare it to cinnamon. Mycologist David Aurora describes it as a blend of red hots and old gym socks. They are found in the Pacific Northwest and on the verge of extinction in Japan as the pine forests that they rely on are being destroyed. But mushrooms are a resilient curiosity of nature, sometimes thriving in environments disturbed by humans. And in Anna Tsing's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, she shared that after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the first thing to grow was a matsutake mushrooms. And so here you see a tarot card from artist Joe Buckley. Excuse me, this just came out and it lets us know that matsutake reminds us that for every action there is a reaction. Be mindful of your choices and compassionate towards the choices of others. And fungi were portrayed as a foreign resource in a planet populated with little green people in a distressed children's scientific novel, The Wonderful Flight to a Mushroom Planet, written by Eleanor Cameron in 1954. The book was so popular that there was even a follow-up called Stowaway to the Mushroom Planet. And Eleanor was also known for publicly speaking out against the Oompa Loompas from the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book, which were originally portrayed as abused African slaves. And so the pictures and descriptions of the Oompa Loompas were then revised in the 1973 edition. So she was on to something. I'm gonna grab my drink. So Eleanor was not far off from her science fiction idea that there were planets ruled by mushrooms. So in 20 million years ago, a giant feasted on the dead, growing slowly into the largest living thing on land, and it belonged to an unlikely group of pioneers that ultimately made life on land possible. So you can watch a PBS documentary on the fungi prototaxides. They do a show called Eons, and they talk about this fungus that ruled the planet at this time. Here's a fossil of it. So the atomic age of visual arts included a lot of fear-based themes and phobias. And Matango is a 1963 Japanese horror film directed by Ishiro Honda. It was nearly banned due to scenes that depicted characters resembling victims of atomic bombings. And it's about a group of castaways on an island who are unwittingly altered by a local species of mutagenic mushrooms. So yeah, I think that we might be working with the mushroom farm here to show this movie near Halloween, just FYI. So I'm gonna take a quick drink and then we're gonna get into the heavy stuff, even more heavy stuff. Okay, so before the 60s, the sacred or psychedelic mushroom use were not understood or common in the US. There were a few key events in popular culture that made psychedelic mushrooms ubiquitous in art and use. And in 1957, Life magazine did a cover story, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which was a photo essay by an amateur mycologist and JP Morgan publicist, Robert Gordon Wasson, describing his experience taking psilocybin mushrooms in 1955 during a Mazatec ritual with Maria Sabina in Oaxaca, Mexico. So Wasson was one of the first Westerners to participate in this ritual. Robert and his wife were fascinated by the difference in cultural attitudes towards fungi in Russia, and the couple began their field research, learning about mushroom use in Siberia, and apparently the US State Department was interested during the Cold War. And recently, through a FOIA request by John Marks, a writer, it was discovered that Robert Gordon Wasson's trip to Oaxaca was funded by the CIA's MKUltra project. And Wasson was supposedly an unwitting participant. And so during the Cold War, there was a lot of research, resources, and money thrown at finding ways to weaponize nature. The CIA was looking for finding chemicals that would get information from people, destroy or controlled minds in order to smear and delegitimize. We still don't know the extent of these programs because the many documents were destroyed. And some of the findings on the MKUltra program are now dramatized in TV series and documentaries, including the first season of the Netflix show Stranger Things. There's another program on Netflix called Wormwood. It's about this period. And so one step beyond a documentary style TV show on ABC, in 1961, the episode The Sacred Mushroom deals with the discovery of mind-altering drugs that were purportedly able to increase the user's psychic powers. So Newland, the TV host, traveled to Mexico where he met with a local leader, and this reality TV style episode was very controversial and was eventually banned from syndication. So it was like kind of the beginning of reality style TV. Although you can watch this on YouTube. So after these major events, and with additional help from people like Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, beatniks, mushrooms and other psychedelics became ubiquitous and were found in everything from yarn art, cookie jars, pot holders, blacklight posters. In his memoir, author Tom Robbins talks about the impact of the Life magazine article on turning on Americans to psychedelic mushrooms, himself included. The Life magazine article sparked immense interest in the Mazatec practice among all of the beatniks and hippies, and interest that proved disastrous for the Mazatec community and for Maria Sabina, shown here in a mural. As the community was besieged by Westerners wanting to experience the mushroom-induced hallucinations, Sabina attracted attention from the Mexican police who thought she was selling drugs, quote, drugs to foreigners. The unwanted attention completely altered the social dynamic of the Mazatec community. The community blamed Sabina, and she was ostracized for a period, and her house was even burned down. And so she, of course, regretted having introduced Wasson to this practice, and Wasson even contended that he was just trying, just innocent, trying to further the sum of human knowledge. Like, I don't think he was like maybe an unwitting participant. Who knows? There's a lot of debate about it. And so mushrooms' popularity in art and use happened during the Vietnam War, and a lot of new declassified evidence shows that the federal counterintelligence programs, COINTELPRO, weaponized and even distributed psychedelics to discredit and criminalize the anti-war movement. So these are some of the groups here that some of y'all may be familiar with that were targeted, and drugs were introduced. These sort of substances were introduced to discredit their programs. And so this eventually led to psilocybin being placed under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. This really jump-started the war on drugs as we know it today. It eventually led to mass incarceration, or as it is called today, the new Jim Crow. Minorities, poor people, and activists were targeted. Today, there are more African-American men in prison than there were slaves in 1950. And we have more people incarcerated per capita than any country in the world, including places with high populations like China that we like to really criticize all the time. And so here's a quote from Nixon's policy advisor at the time. So around the same time, in 1969, a scientist named Robert Whitaker published the first major revision to the Two Kingdom classification system, and he proposed there be 5 kingdoms, meaning that fungi would have its own kingdom. And this date is significant not only because it was the year of the moon landing, but also such great leaps in one area, the US made huge stumbles backwards with the war on drugs. With so little knowledge of mushrooms, research was shut down. Mushroom imagery and art persisted through the 70s, but started to fade and be considered kitsch as time went on. In the mid-80s, the Japanese company Nintendo introduced their console in the US. Mario and his brother Luigi traveled to the Mushroom Kingdom to rescue Princess Toadstool from Bowser. And if the player gets the super mushroom, the Mario grows to double his size and gains the ability to break bricks above him. The Mario mushrooms resembles Amanita muscaria when ingested safely, is known to make you feel bigger or like flying. The franchise was so popular that it spun off into live action and animated movies and more. Super Mario Brothers isn't the only video game that Nintendo created fungal characters with superpowers. Here's several characters from Pokemon. So Morlul, Shroomish, Fungi, Amoonguss, Parasect, which looks like an insect infected by a mushroom. And this brings me to the next more modern video game, which is pretty cool. And so there's a video that explains this, but there's this video game is called The Last of Us, and it uses the concept of the parasitic fungus cordyceps, or there's a couple of other ones like the one that they show in Planet Earth, where the fungus takes over the muscular control of an ant, and then it climbs to the highest point in the tree, and then a mushroom pops out of its neck, and then it spreads spores. Well, the theory of this video, or the theme of this video game, is that it jumped species. So it went from like insects or, and to humans. And so humans are become zombified. And yeah, that's like where the gameplay goes. And so Mushroom Men is another series of video games. And I mention it because it was developed in Austin. And the story revolves around a civil war between mushroom men in a human world. And Truffle Trouble is another game that was released a few years ago in the series. In the last few decades, and especially with the popularity of the Super Mario Brothers, pop mushroom imagery has made a comeback, and not surprisingly, from Japanese artists. Here's a few valuable paintings by Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, known for her colorful and poppy polka dots. Sotheby's estimates this one to be valued at 2.2 million. Yayoi has lived in both the US and Japan. It was part of the New York counterculture scene in the 60s, doing performance art and painting colorful polka dots on everything. And her early work is said to have been influenced by Andy Warhol. And so Takashi Murakami, considered the Warhol of Japan, is known for his contemporary pop synthesis of fine art and popular culture, particularly his use of boldly graphic and colorful anime and manga cartoon styles. Murakami became famous in the 1990s for his super flat theory, a blend of high and low. His output includes paintings, sculptures, drawings, animations, and collaborations with brands like Louis Vuitton. So the Haas brothers, their twin brothers, Simon and Nikolai Haas, run this furniture design and fabrication studio out of Los Angeles, and they both grew up in Austin, Texas. They create everything from a set design to wearable art, masks for Lady Gaga, to gold leaf furniture for Louis Vuitton stores. The furniture blurs between art and design, as you can see from these pieces here. Based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, artist Amy Ross is interested in the idea of artists as a mad scientist. She creates art that turns the natural world on its head, morphing flora and fauna together into curious hybrid creatures. This piece titled Fairy Ring mixes the matching different types of mushrooms with different types of bodies, anthropomorphizing them. These mad scientists' inspirations really exemplifies the value of individualism in material culture. In Soviet times, there used to be a magazine called America, issued by the US State Department. And one of the articles in the magazine from the mid-70s was called The Most Delicious American Mushrooms, as described the 17 most exquisite mushrooms in America. And that starting point of this series of watercolor paintings from Nikita Shalini from Ukraine. She also does a similar anthropomorphized mushroom-headed people style in these watercolor paintings that explore an imagery, mushroom culture, living somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Russia. They sprout from imagination and live their dreamy lives, seemingly free and equal, just like mushrooms in America, right? It's beautiful. I like that one a lot. And so Vladimir Grieg's individual style originates from the Soviet print design of the 50s and 60s, and his graphic series are often saturated with mysticism, characteristics of the plots in Russian literature and early 20th century, as seen here. And his graphic work even incorporates intricate glass beadwork, as seen here, where an amanita is anthropomorphized in a library, just like us right now. You can see a little bit closer up here, the beadwork. Pretty cool. The same concept carries through in this installation by Melissa J. Craig of book-shaped Amanita muscaria, plays into people's mycophobia and mystical relationships with fungi. And the artists parallel that books can be an agent of change, much like mushrooms can be. And using his training as a scientist in his work as an artist, Karsten Haller's primary concerns relate to the nature of human perception and self-exploration. He has undertaken many projects that invite viewer participation and interaction while questioning human behavior, perception, and logic. His laboratory of doubt embodied in objects ranging from carousels to slippery slides to upside down goggles, often contains playful, hallucinatory, or darkly humorous overtones. in order to provoke experience and reflection. And so Anton Korbatov is a young Russian digital artist that paints immersive sci-fi inspired mushroom conceptual art. And so here's a modern interpretation of the bee mushroom cave drawing from Africa, done by San Francisco artist John Speaker. And this cave painting is interpreted by anthropologists as a mushroom shaman buried in his clothes, and when unearthed sometime later, his body was covered with tiny mushrooms growing in his clothes. And if anybody's seen that famous TED talk by J. Rim Lee on the Infinite Burial Project, or the mushroom burial suit, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the concept. And interestingly enough, a modern TV show episode included a plot line with some similar art direction. So the characters of the TV show Hannibal are hunting a killer who's buried his victims alive, so they will become fertilizer for his garden of fungus. The killer turns out to be a pharmacist named Eldon Steinmetz, who seeks out diabetic patients and replaces their insulin with a high dose of sugar, which makes a great substrate for mushrooms. Pretty corny, but fun to look at, fun to watch. Chris Jury is known for his environmental installations. His body of work includes ephemeral assemblies of natural materials. This is known as land art. And this 3D sculpture of mushroom clouds evoking the atomic bomb are made out of as many as 6,000 pieces of dried mushrooms strung from floor to ceiling. The artist questions the ties between nature and man-made destruction through visual metaphor. This land or ephemeral artist, Sarah Alpuro from Finland, also uses mushrooms as her primary medium. The compositions are stunning. The art uses no synthetic materials, and the compositions are left for hikers to see in the forest. So here we see Christian Nagel, a British street artist known for his oversized mushroom sculptures made from polyurethane, which he places high on buildings, and they stretch all over the place in Europe and the United States, and even Southern Africa. And I'm assuming everyone is familiar with Banksy, the mysterious street artist. This famous street art from London speaks for itself. It was impossible to find much information about it because the search was flooded with all kinds of merchandise. You can buy this print on just about anything, a pillow, a canvas bag. So here you see Leon Keir. He created a 3D street painting called Virtual Transition. And it's a fungi-powered digital motherboard. And so here's a sound mixed media installation by the Mycelium Network Society, which includes a group of artists and biohackers all over the globe. And this installation taps into sound of Ganoderma reishi, using custom signal processors and contact microphones. And these electronic devices detect changes within living mycelial atoms and transmit this information across radio frequencies, which is spatialized and experienced as an audio within an installation. And the result is what described as a new kind of biotech organism, a kind of acoustic creature that makes sound like many biological organisms do. So this is some photos of the art. And if you all have a chance, we did a program. So I guess a year ago, little year and a half ago, we did a program fundraiser with the Octopus Project, and they used mushrooms and made music. And you can watch it all on our YouTube channel. But I was happy to see that when Merlin Sheldrake came out with his book, he used the self-referential marketing strategy for Entangled Life by inoculating the book with oyster mushroom spores. And he worked with a sound artist from the UK, Michael Prime, to record this bioelectricity activity of the fungus with the control of an oscillator. And so Michael Prime can modify the frequency range of the sound and use filters to shape the raw sound. But the fluctuations in pitch and rhyme that you hear are real-time sonic representations of the activity of the fungus as it eats the book. And so I've heard the same thing talking to the Octopus Project. So the sounds, they essentially were letting the mushrooms do their compose, and then they added to that. And they were able to choose the sort of types of instruments that they would then play. But it was a really fun project and really fun to learn in person with on making sound from mushrooms. So that kind of concludes things. And I have some like summaries, just some of my own thoughts, and then I have a few discussion points that you're all welcome to. We can chat about. So I really liked this quote from Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring. So in nature, nothing exists alone, but man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. And the war on drugs is a war on nature, and it's important to approach history and its artifacts from this macro view and the social behavioral perspectives to help us understand where the shift towards individualism and materialism happened and the war on nature began. And so early artifacts that we are in conflict with and what is considered art today for many reasons. The values, identities, and deities of larger tribal groups were represented through reverence towards nature and its resources. Spiritual artifacts have been replaced with art that represents self-identity and materialism. The expectation today is that art is an expression of individual identity, a brand, or something that is valuable that can be auctioned to the highest bidder, which ends up being, as we know, it's a tax deduction for the wealthy, the ruling class. And it's an insider game. There's a lot of price fixing and manufactured scarcity, which I'm sure you all are, more and more people are becoming aware of, like the sort of racket of like commodity art. So after the Emerald texts and Hermetism were reintroduced to Europe, the spiritual connection with nature was largely replaced with material quests, and Western colonization and the so-called Age of Discovery began. Some alchemists interpreted Hermetic philosophy as a way to control and dominate nature. Western civilization turned towards materialism and quests of accumulation of gold in search for immortality and a new religion per se. So monotheistic Western societies pride themselves on understanding of material science, yet hardly understand the fungi queendom or the relationship of dark matter and the consciousness of all living things. And fungi is more than a metaphor or mystery, fear of the unknown, similar to Homo sapiens searching for the philosopher's stone. Mushrooms and lichens recycle, transmute, and transform. Fungi are the ultimate transmuters. We have the ability to transmute one atomic element into another for the purpose of creating mushroom clouds that kill billions of living things with the push of a button. The internal combustion engine, fungicides, pesticides used in industrial agriculture are also praised as material successes. but are some of the most destructive forces on this planet and to our health. The ruling class continues to create existential threats using the good versus evil binary, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on viruses. Despite all of this, art has a way of healing. We consciously and unconsciously tell stories in hopes to enlighten those that try to dominate nature. So that's my conclusion. Thank you, everyone, for listening. So I want to take questions. And then I also, these are just kind of questions I had for us as a community to like think about and share today. If everyone's down for sharing, we can turn up the lights too if everybody wants to.
Maybe
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the effect after the Life magazine article and subsequent television program with Maria Sabina? It seems like she became a line woman of this story and began and ended with her as far as authority maybe are concerned. But what was the effect on other healers in Mexico? Did it force on the ground or what?
Yeah, I'm actually not so much an expert on that period of history. And I know that there were a lot of people that were asked by Gordon Wasson that they refused because it's very sacred, you know. They don't see it as like something that, you know, is to be shared. And I know there's a lot of debate. And
She was tricked, right?
What was that?
She was essentially tricked. I mean, she
yeah. A lot of people say she was
lied
coerced and lied. Like there were all kinds of things going on at that time. And there's a lot of debate too, like because this is so sacred that, you know, it's used today, and especially like through this kind of revival or this resurgence and decriminalization stuff that's going on. Like, how do we like, you know, it's becoming a commodity. Like everything is in this like commodified culture that we live in, extractive commodified culture. And so a lot of people, you know, didn't want to give up this information because there was such kinship in that community, in that place, in that geographic place. And one of the reasons why I really dove deep into this, you know, several years back is because there was so much discussion about how we interact with these plants and mushrooms. And I just wanted to know all the uses all over the world, like as much as I could. And of course it's never ending because that's a huge freaking rabbit hole. But I spent a little bit of time reading lots of books and reading lots of blog posts and reading all these like conflicting opinions. And, you know, we know that all of these mushrooms are, you know, different type species of mushrooms are used in all different places. There's evidence too that they were part of like, you know, Vedic religions and used in Europe and Africa. There's just that all these things have, you know, been erased through like the colonization and ecological destruction and other like catastrophic events. You know, there's theories that there's just all of these things that are prehistory or, you know, were erased when we've had like catastrophic extinction type events that we just don't even know. So, you know, I think that it's important that we, you know, try to just learn as much as we can about these plants. But I kind of take the stance of like looking at the power dynamic and the power structure we're in. And I think that all plants and drugs should be decriminalized, but the system that we're in right now, like it's guaranteed it's going to go to the highest bidder, like commodified, like it's already happened with marijuana. They're trying to undo things in places where they've decriminalized psilocybin. So, I mean, I just don't know if you know, the everyday people, if we have that power to be able to collectively organize and stop these things from happening, because it's happening already. So that was long. I don't know if that's what you're looking for. That was kind of a rant. Sorry, everybody. But that kind of brings me to my first question, like how as a community can we work towards the original goals of alchemy or the Hermetic philosophy. And so we all know this phrase, as above, so below, which is an ancient quote that describes the idea of what happens in the higher realm and plane of existence also happens in the lower realm, and it comes from the Emerald text and the Hermetic text. And so this quote that I'm going to share is from the book Radical Mycology, which I highly recommend for all kinds of things about mycology. But Peter McCoy wrote this book. So this is what he says. Alchemy is one of the most radical approaches we can take in reclaiming our physical and psychological sovereignty and health. The ancient art approaches illnesses by working on their root causes, whether they be physical, spiritual, or energetic. Alchemy provides insights into the patterns of nature through direct experience and the production of potent physio-spiritual medicines, contributing to the greater level of harmony within and between oneself and the environment. Is a reflective process that attunes the student to inherent patterns in nature and how they are expressed through their material form. It offers sympathetic and empathetic approaches to confronting disease individually, culturally, and ecologically through understanding. It is a study of interconnectedness, interconnection, and relationship that supersedes reductionist scientific models by integrating the observations of qualitative and quantitative measures with the experience of a direct relationship with the subject. And so, I mean, that's what I've been trying to do, just have more of these interactions with not just ethnogen, but also all things living down to the microbes, understanding what microbes are doing. Like that's how we integrate ourselves back into nature, which has really been taken away, and we've been extracted in the same way that we're extracting nature and looking for endless profit and gold. So yeah, anybody else have anything they want to share?
I have a question about Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
When the author, you said he found a book in the library right before he wrote, what was the thing again?
It was Mordecai's. I might have to jump
Lewis
back.
Carroll, he said he signed it out or something.
Yeah, there was a page missing on the fly Garrett.
And I'm not trying to question it, but like, how did they know? They were just like, maybe taken it out or something like that.
Yeah, that after he, checked it back into the library, the page was missing. That's fun, right?
Yeah.
Don't do that in this library. Yeah. So this was another question I had. How was the Western ideology of constant quest for gold and materialism and individualism affect us through this current health crisis? And it was like a very heavy topic, but I have opinions and I'll share them if you guys want to hear. And so I'm sure everyone's heard stories about the sort of ironically named CARES Act, which was the largest transfer of wealth to the billionaire class in history. And stories about small business loans going to all across the board, going to like larger corporations. And so the motive, of course, is, continual growth and profits and extraction over like people's health. And the motives have been about, these individualistic responses and have further, confused us all and made for a very terrible last couple of years. And so this is I like to look at this, just look at the data. There you go. All right. Yeah.
Well, first of all, Beautiful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
This is my first time here, and she invited me. And so the one question is that I'm never,
Mhm,
and I think one part of the presentation is something about
mhm.
how big is I kind of see it with the color.
Yeah. It's pretty small and like really like the sort of US like and I've driven through San Juan del Pacifico, which is where Maria Sabina and the Mazatec people live. It is completely gentrified. You know, it's like you can get pasta and pizza and like, you know, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's influenced by kind of Western culture, not so much the local people there, but there are people that have kind of glommed on to that because, you know, the way that colonization has made things difficult for people to live their like indigenous lifeways where they can be in harmony with nature. They have to make a living and do these things that make money. And tourism, of course, ends up being the easiest way, especially when you have all these Westerners and people traveling through for um, looking for psychedelic mushrooms. So yeah, so I would say it's not like super huge thing, but there's definitely like, you know, there's definitely people in Mexico that have, you know, kind of partaken in the Western interest.
Second question is that are there, you know, other world zones?
Mhm.
Are there like particular areas of
That where they grow, or like where, because San Juan del Pacifico is one of the places that people go to, but I honestly like I don't know that much, and I don't partake in like ethniogenic travel myself, so I don't know much about that kind of stuff. But like I just know from going on a different like a longer trip through Oaxaca. It wasn't focused on ethnogens, but like I did drive through and kind of see the town. But yeah, I don't know a whole lot about areas. I know there's like places where different people have set up shop, mostly like Europeans and Canadians. You know, Westerners, Americans like setting up shop in these places because it's very inexpensive. I'm not going to get much into that because it's like a whole nother talk. But yeah. So yeah, let's see. So we looked at art from a mycophilic versus mycophobic cultures. Did anybody notice kind of differences in like the expression? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just straight. Yeah. Yeah. Like I put these two side by side. You know, they're done in very different times, but you have, you know, Amy Ross, who's trying to make a statement about like materialism. And even though like we're still like connected to, you know, our fungal microbiomes, we're part of that. Like there's this materialism that's still there that's hard to escape. And then to the right, you see the fairy ring painting that really, I think like probably people's like thoughts, perceptions, social behaviors really drove how people interpreted that. But, you know, these concepts were very common. And then the last question I have, and as artists, how can we use materials that have little impact? And I put these two kind of side by side. So, you know, this poly-based mushroom art. This guy was from the UK. And then Sarah, she's from Finland, which is home of the Sami people, who are known for using amanitas, and they have a real direct relationship to fungi and connection with nature and harmony with nature. So these are just two examples. And I just want to plug one event. We're actually going to have a couple events. On the 22nd, we are doing a workshop with Buzzmill Coffee and the Lumber Society. And it's a myco art workshop, and I believe there's still tickets. Actually ran into Mark, who does all the programming at Kinko's yesterday, and he's like, we're going to make more tickets. So I was printing stuff out for this. And he was there. There's like our mycelium, like cross paths and Kinko's. So they're going to have 30 tickets to this, and you can learn from a local artist here. Her name is Fruiting Body Apothecary, and she does all types of mycelium-based art. And so you can learn from her how she does this process, and we'll have different mushroom spawn and things you can take home and experiment at home. And then later in the fall, closer to Halloween, we're also going to have a workshop out at the Myco Research Station. And it's part of our Roots and Wings pop-up event called Fluorescent Forest, the Thinning of the Veil. You guys want to come, right? That sounds really cool, right? Let's thin that veil. Okay, thanks everybody.